A little girl sat alone by the school gate, her tiny hands clutching a worn-out backpack as the world rushed past her. No one stopped. No one asked, until one man, wealthy, powerful, but empty inside, saw her. In that single moment, two broken hearts recognized each other. He was a millionaire CEO, surrounded by glass walls and silent rooms, yet starving for something real. She was a child, invisible to the crowd, waiting for a promise that never came. Their meeting was not chance, it was destiny. A story of loneliness colliding with compassion, of walls torn down and hope rebuilt, of how one simple act of kindness can rewrite a lifetime. Stay with us, because what happens next will remind you that family is not about blood, but about who shows up and stays. Subscribe now to Hidden Echo Stories and let this tale awaken your heart. Jacob Reed lived in a world most people only dreamed of. From the outside, his life appeared flawless. A towering penthouse above the glittering skyline, glass walls that caught every sunrise, and closets lined with tailored suits. He was the kind of man whose name appeared in glossy magazines, praised for running one of Savannah's most successful hotel groups. Yet behind the polish and the power, his home was quiet, achingly quiet. There were no footsteps to echo down the hall except his own, no laughter to soften the corners of the room, no warmth in the air except for the hum of machinery. Every morning, Jacob rose before dawn. He drank his coffee black, seated at a marble counter that gleamed like an unwelcoming altar. His phone buzzed with endless reminders, calls, contracts, numbers that would impress shareholders but never silence the gnawing ache inside him. His penthouse reflected his life perfectly, beautiful, expensive, and utterly lifeless. Jacob's childhood was a memory he rarely allowed himself to revisit. Still, there were reminders, like the old family photograph by the door, faded with time. In it, a boy stood stiffly beside his parents, their hands almost touching but never quite meeting. That distance, even in a photo, was the story of his early years. He had grown up with everything money could provide, but little of what mattered most. And though he had spent decades outgrowing that boy, some mornings the loneliness still came back, raw and sharp as ever. On one particular morning, something inside Jacob shifted. As his driver waited to deliver him to another routine meeting, Jacob surprised himself with a quiet command. "Drop me off here, I'll walk." The driver blinked but obeyed. Jacob stepped out, inhaling crisp air that carried the scents of fresh bread, traffic, and morning coffee from the cafes. For once, he wanted to feel the city, not just pass through it behind tinted glass. As he walked, the streets buzzed with the joyful chaos of families. Children tugged on oversized backpacks, parents hurried with shoelaces and packed lunches, laughter echoing beneath the banners strung across the schoolyard. Jacob slowed his pace, almost in awe. It had been years since he noticed such simple beauty, and yet with every step memories stirred, memories of standing on the outside, watching other children embraced while he waited alone. And then he saw her. At first she looked almost invisible against the iron gate. A little girl no more than 7 sat curled up, knees pulled close to her chest. Her dress was worn thin, her shoes too small, her backpack frayed at the seams. Around her, the morning carried on, teachers calling names, parents waving, kids running into the playground. But she was still, heartbreakingly still, as if the world had forgotten her. Jacob froze. A jolt went through him, something stronger than pity, recognition. In her small form he saw himself, the boy who had once stood apart, unseen and unchosen. His heart hammered, a tightness rising in his chest. Time seemed to hold its breath. He couldn't walk past. Jacob stepped closer, lowering himself to the cold pavement. Up close, he saw her lips tremble, her small hands twisting the strap of her bag as though she could vanish inside it. "Hey there," he said gently, forcing his voice to steady. She didn't answer. Her chin stayed tucked, her eyes fixed on the ground. "What's your name?" he tried again. After a long pause, a whisper slipped out. "Emma." "Hi, Emma, my name's Jacob." He smiled, though she still didn't look up. "Are you waiting for someone?" She nodded quickly. "My mom. She said she'd come, but she's late." Her voice was almost too soft to hear. Jacob's chest tightened. He asked why she wasn't inside with the other children. Emma's small fingers knotted in her skirt before she replied. They said, "Until we pay, I can't go back in." The words fell heavy, like stones dropped between them. Jacob swallowed hard, fighting the surge of emotion threatening to overtake him. Around them the school bell rang, and the gates clanged shut. Laughter faded into silence, leaving only Emma and Jacob on the outside. He should have left. He had meetings, deadlines, and empire waiting, but none of it mattered. Not when a child sat here alone, barred from belonging because of something beyond her control. For the first time in years, Jacob felt utterly present, not as a CEO, not as a businessman, but as a man who knew too well what it meant to be unseen. "Would you like me to wait with you?" he asked softly. Emma glanced at him then, just for a heartbeat. Her eyes, wide and blue, shimmered with fear and something fragile, hope. She didn't speak, but she nodded. That tiny motion was enough. So Jacob stayed. The chill of the pavement seeped through his suit, the sun climbed higher and the streets grew quieter. But none of it mattered. For once he wasn't counting minutes or calculating deals. He was simply there, beside a little girl who had been left behind. Her small hand rested near his, not quite touching but close enough to remind him of something he had almost forgotten, what it felt like to choose and to be chosen. And in that quiet moment, Jacob knew he could not walk away. Jacob returned to his world of glass towers and boardrooms, but something inside him was unsettled. As his colleagues reviewed charts and spoke in clipped voices about projections and profits, his mind wandered back to the school gate. He could still see Emma's trembling lips, her small hands gripping the strap of her backpack as though it were the only anchor she had left. For years, Jacob had trained himself to be unshakable. No deal was too stressful, no loss too personal. But that morning had stripped away the armor he wore so well. He found himself typing the wrong numbers, missing questions, even laughing too late at a joke he didn't hear. His assistant's reminders pinged one after another on his phone, but they blurred together into static. At last, Jacob pushed his chair back, startling the room. "Family emergency," he muttered, his voice flat but resolute. Before anyone could object, he grabbed his coat and left. For once, his calendar could wait. The city looked different when he stepped outside. It was no longer a background to his success, but a place filled with unseen stories, each one heavy with need. His steps quickened as he turned down familiar streets, hopping against hope that Emma might still be there. And she was. She sat on the curb, her small body folded into itself, her face hidden behind messy strands of hair. Jacob's chest ached at the sight. He knelt again, careful not to startle her. "Hey, Emma, sorry I took so long." His voice was softer than he remembered hearing it, almost unfamiliar to his own ears. He offered her his coat. For a moment she hesitated, her eyes darting up to his, searching for sincerity. Then she pulled the coat around herself, burying her face in the fabric as if it were a shield against the world. That single act of trust cut deeper than any contract Jacob had ever signed. "Have you had anything to eat?" he asked. Emma shook her head. Without hesitation, Jacob hurried to a food cart and returned with a sandwich and chocolate milk. She accepted it cautiously, taking small bites while her eyes flickered up to watch his reaction. Jacob kept his questions gentle. Slowly, Emma's words came, fragile but steady. She spoke of her mother, Sarah, who cleaned houses when work was available. She mentioned nights spent in the car when money ran out, promises whispered in the dark that things would get better, promises she no longer believed. Each confession pierced Jacob. He wanted to fix everything at once, call in favors, buy her security, erase every scar of neglect. But he knew money alone wasn't enough. She needed something more fragile, more precious, someone who would not leave. As the morning stretched on, Jacob called Sarah's number, recited carefully by Emma. No answer. He tried again, his jaw tight, but only voicemail greeted him. Anxiety gnawed at him, but he forced himself to stay calm for Emma's sake. Eventually, Jacob approached the principal, Mrs. Bennet, his voice firm but quiet. "I'd like to pay Emma's tuition. She deserves to be in class, not out here." Mrs. Bennet hesitated, citing policies and waiting lists. But when Jacob's eyes held hers, she seemed to recognize something, an ache that went beyond wealth, beyond power. She softened. "Let me see what I can do." Relieved, Jacob returned to Emma, offering a small smile. "Let's get you home," he said. She hesitated but slipped her hand into his. The walk across town was slow. Emma spoke in fragments, stories about her favorite teacher, a stuffed bear she once loved, songs her mother used to sing. Each word was a fragile thread, binding Jacob to her in ways he couldn't explain. By the time they reached the worn motel with its flickering neon, Jacob felt as though he'd stepped into another life. Emma's gratitude was simple but powerful. "Thank you for staying," she whispered before disappearing inside. Jacob stood there for a long time, staring at the cracked door that closed behind her. He had meetings waiting, a future carefully constructed over decades. But all he could think about was a little girl who had nothing, and how desperately he wanted to give her something that couldn't be bought. He returned later that day, groceries in hand. Emma opened the door, her smile shy but luminous. Inside, the motel was dim, its wallpaper peeling, the air heavy with the scent of old cigarettes. Emma's mother, Sarah, sat in a worn chair, her exhaustion etched deep into her face. She eyed Jacob warily. "Who are you?" Jacob spoke carefully, introducing himself, explaining how he found Emma outside the school. His words were simple, without grandeur or promises. He admitted he hadn't known what the right thing was, only that leaving hadn't felt right. Sarah's defenses wavered. Gratitude flickered in her posture, though pride kept her from asking for more. "Thank you for staying with her," she said quietly. "Most people just walk by." Jacob's chest tightened. "I couldn't," he admitted, stopping himself before revealing too much of his own past. That night they shared a humble dinner at a diner down the street. The food was simple, but Emma's laughter filled the space like music. Jacob hardly touched his soup. He was too busy listening, truly listening for the first time in years. Sarah spoke of hardship, of jobs that vanished, of nights spent in fear of what tomorrow might bring. She tried to mask her vulnerability with pride, but Jacob saw the strength beneath it, a strength born of survival. When they returned to the motel, Emma clutched Jacob's coat tightly. "He didn't leave, Mom," she whispered. Those words, so innocent and raw, cut straight through the walls Sarah had built. For the first time, she allowed herself to hope. As Jacob walked away that night, the city lights looked different. The penthouse waiting for him felt more like a prison than a prize. And for the first time in his life, he realized that belonging wasn't about what he owned, but about who he chose to stand beside. And Jacob knew he had already made his choice. The days that followed pulled Jacob into a world far removed from boardrooms and polished marble floors. Each time he returned to the motel, he felt less like a visitor and more like a part of something fragile but real. He brought small things, groceries, crayons, even flowers, and each gift seemed to chip away at the wall of pride Sarah had built around herself. Emma, with her wide eyes and cautious hope, welcomed him with a smile that grew brighter with every visit. Jacob was no longer a stranger in their story. He learned the rhythms of their days, Sarah rising early to chase down work, Emma practicing letters by the dim light of a flickering lamp, meals stretched thin but shared with gratitude. He began to fill in the missing pieces, not with money alone but with presence. He fixed the leaky faucet, packed lunches for Emma, left little notes folded beside her books. Slowly, he discovered that love was not grand gestures, but the quiet act of showing up again and again. Nights at the motel became gentler. Jacob read Emma bedtime stories, sometimes drifting off in the battered chair beside her bed. Sarah would watch in silence, her suspicions softening into something more complicated, respect, perhaps even trust. When she finally spoke one evening, her voice was low, steady. "You have a whole life waiting somewhere else. Why us?" Jacob hesitated. He thought of the sterile penthouse, of the echo of his footsteps through empty rooms. "Because you make me feel like I belong somewhere real," he answered simply. Sarah said nothing, but when she handed him a steaming cup of tea, it was her way of saying he was welcome. The bond deepened. Emma braided a bracelet of colorful thread and tied it around Jacob's wrist. "So you remember you're not alone," she whispered. He wore it proudly, a splash of innocence beside his expensive watch. With each passing day, Jacob's heart shifted from the currency of contracts to the wealth of laughter, shared meals, and unguarded moments. Eventually, Jacob brought Sarah and Emma to a small townhouse he had once bought as an investment. Modest, sunlit, with a tiny yard in the back, it felt worlds away from the motel. "It's only temporary," he assured them, though hope laced his voice. When Emma stepped inside, her eyes wide, and Sarah hovered uncertainly behind her, Jacob knew he wanted this place to become more than shelter. He wanted it to be their home. And for a while, it was perfect. Mornings began with shared breakfasts, Emma's laughter echoing down the hallway, Sarah humming while she swept sunlight into the rooms. Jacob discovered the joy of planting flowers in the yard, of tasting Sarah's apple pie, of losing board games to a 7-year-old who giggled with triumph. The townhouse became a sanctuary of small joys, stitched together by belonging. But the outside world noticed. Whispers spread among parents at Emma's school. Why was one of the city's wealthiest men spending his days with a struggling single mother and her child? Rumors twisted kindness into suspicion, and before long, Sarah was called into the principal's office. She left shaken, her cheeks flushed with humiliation. Child Protective Services arrived soon after, their questions sharp and cold. That evening, Sarah's voice trembled with fear. "People are watching us. They're judging Emma. I can't risk losing her. You need to stop coming around so much." Jacob's world tilted. His instinct was to fight, to argue, but when he saw the terror in Sarah's eyes, he swallowed his protest. "If that's what you need," he said softly, though the words broke him. The following days dragged like years. Jacob went through the motions of his business, but every glance at the bracelet on his wrist was a reminder of what he had lost. Then one night his phone rang. Emma's voice, trembling and urgent. "Mom's sick. She fainted. Please, I don't know what to do." Jacob didn't hesitate. He raced through the city, every red light an enemy. At the townhouse he found Sarah collapsed, her skin pale, her breathing shallow. Scooping her into his arms, he rushed her and Emma to the hospital. Hours blurred into beeping monitors, whispered reassurances, and Emma curled up on chairs, his coat wrapped around her small frame. When Sarah finally stirred, her first words shattered Jacob. "I was wrong. Family means letting someone stay even when it's hard." Tears stung his eyes as he whispered back, "I'm not going anywhere. Not now, not ever." For the first time, Sarah didn't argue. She only squeezed his hand. Recovery was slow, but each day brought more strength to Sarah's face, more laughter to Emma's voice. When Sarah returned home, Jacob was there, waiting with flowers and a homemade dinner. The three of them ate together, laughter and relief mingling in the air. But Jacob didn't stop there. He faced the judgment head-on. At a meeting with the school board, he spoke not with power but with honesty. He told Emma's story, not just hers but his own. "A child's worth isn't measured by her family's bank account," he said quietly. "It's measured by who shows up for her." His words carried the weight of truth, and for once no one argued. New policies were drafted, scholarships offered, families supported. Back at the townhouse, life blossomed again. They tended a small garden together, baked cookies on rainy afternoons, and filled the walls with Emma's drawings. Sarah's confidence grew as she began helping other families at the school. Jacob's life shifted permanently, calls taken at the kitchen table, late meetings ignored in favor of Emma's bedtime stories. One evening, as autumn leaves drifted past the window, Sarah sat beside him on the porch. "Thank you for staying," she whispered. He squeezed her hand, his voice rough. You gave me a home. Seasons changed. Emma stood on stage at her school assembly, her voice trembling but clear. Last year, I was the girl sitting alone at the gate, but now I know what it means to be home. Applause thundered, but Jacob and Sarah only had eyes for her, their hands clasped together, their hearts full. Later, under strings of lights in their backyard, Jacob and Sarah exchanged quiet vows. No grand speeches, no orchestra, just the promise to keep choosing each other. Emma placed a drawing in their hands, 3 stick figures holding hands beneath an open gate. Jacob framed it by the door, a symbol of how far they had come. From that day forward, the townhouse was no longer just a house. It was laughter in the hallways, the smell of Sarah's pies, Emma's art spilling across the walls, and the hum of a family that had chosen each other against all odds. And Jacob, once a man defined by silence and glass towers, finally understood what it meant to come home. Life has a way of surprising us in the quietest, most unexpected moments. For Jacob Reed, a man who once believed success was measured by wealth and recognition, everything changed the morning he saw a little girl sitting alone at the school gate. That moment shattered the walls he had built around his heart and forced him to remember a truth he had long forgotten. No one was ever meant to live unseen, unheard, or unloved. Emma was more than just a child in need. She was a mirror, reflecting back to Jacob the loneliness he had carried his whole life. And Sarah, her mother, showed him that strength doesn't come from riches or titles, but from the courage to keep fighting for love even when the world tries to take it away. Together, the 3 of them created something powerful, a family built not by blood or obligation, but by choice. Their journey was not easy. Whispers from the outside world, suspicion from strangers, and the crushing weight of poverty threatened to break them apart. Yet each trial only revealed a deeper truth, that love grows strongest when it is tested. When Sarah collapsed, when Emma cried out in fear, Jacob didn't turn away. He stayed. And in staying, he discovered that true wealth is measured not in bank accounts, but in moments of belonging. From a cold penthouse to a warm, imperfect townhouse, Jacob's transformation was not about losing status but about finding life. He learned to measure days not by contracts signed, but by laughter echoing through the kitchen, bedtime stories whispered in the dark, and the sight of Emma's drawings taped proudly on the walls. He found what his heart had been starving for: connection, meaning, and home. And perhaps the most beautiful truth of all is this: what began as one man stopping to notice a little girl has grown into something far greater. It is proof that kindness has the power to change not just one life, but many. Because when Jacob chose to see Emma, he also chose to see himself, and in doing so, he rewrote the story of who he was meant to be. If this story touched your heart, let it remind you of the power of showing up, of choosing to love when it would be easier to walk away, of staying when the world tells you to leave. Because sometimes the smallest acts of compassion create the biggest transformations. Here at Hidden Echo Stories, we believe every story has the power to awaken something in us, something tender, something brave, something hopeful. If Jacob's journey reminded you that love can be found in the most unexpected places, then stay with us. Subscribe to Hidden Echo Stories and let us share more tales that heal, inspire, and remind us all that home is not a place, but the people who choose to stand beside us.